I was at the conjunction on the delta of two rivers in Tibet, and we did a feast offering in a circle, Dakini feast, and it started not only raining but sleeting and snowing while we were sitting there in a circle. And when you're in a ceremony like that, you can't stop and get up and say, okay, we're going to move this inside. You just stay there. So we actually ended up being like up to, sitting on the ground, up to, over our legs in water that was freezing. And it was also very joyful, we were laughing and so on. But anyway, then at the end I got up and I walked out onto this delta between these two really rushing rivers, and I found a stone which was in the shape of the Khatvanga staff. And I thought, this is it. This is my message from this pilgrimage. I think often pilgrimages will have a theme. And so for me, the theme became self-seeding, or wholeness unto myself, being able to feel that masculine within myself and be healed by that, because I had felt so incomplete, like, I have to find this outer man to make myself complete. And so this process of sort of blocking up that hole where all this energy leaks out, that feeling, and realizing I am whole and sovereign unto myself. And I think that's the message of the Khatvanga.
I'm Olivia Clementine, and this is Love and Liberation. Today, our guest is Lama Tsultrim Allione. Lama Tsultrim is an author, internationally known Buddhist teacher, and the founder and resident Lama of Tara Mandala Retreat Center. She is the author of Women of Wisdom, Feeding Your Demons, and now her new book, Wisdom Rising, Journey into the Mandala of the Empowered Feminine, which we will talk about today. Born in New England to an academic family, Lama Tsultrim traveled to India in her late teens, and in 1970, at the age of 22, was ordained as a Tibetan Buddhist nun by His Holiness the 16th Karmapa. After 4 years living as a nun in the Himalayan region, she returned her monastic vows, married, and raised a family of 3 children. Lama Tsultrim is known for her ability to translate the wisdom of the ancient Tibetan Buddhist tradition into clear teachings that are relatable and relevant to Western audiences. Lama Tsultrim continues to guide Tara Mandala as the resident Lama, as well as thousands of students around the world.
I would love to know what sparked your interest in Tibetan Buddhism.
It really came through an experience that I had with a book. And the book is called Man and His Symbols by Carl Jung, and his colleagues also participated in that. The book has a Tibetan mandala on the cover. And so one day I was walking around Harvard Square. I was visiting my grandparents who lived in Cambridge. And I went to the Coop, the Harvard Co-op, and the book was sitting on a table. I actually remember, you know how sometimes in bookstores they put out tables and the books are lying flat?
Yeah.
And so I was looking down at this book, at this Tibetan mandala, and it was a very odd feeling that I felt like it had the key to something, that there was something about this mandala that had the potential to take me somewhere. I ended up buying that book. It's a sort of big format, like a coffee table book. There's a lot of images in it, and it had more images of Tibetan mandalas and also writings by Jung and Von Franz and some of the other people that worked with him. And so it was really in a way through the mandala, because then I eventually went to India and Nepal, and my goal was to learn how to paint these mandalas that felt very mystically potent to me. And I didn't end up doing that. I didn't end up learning to paint mandalas, but I did meet the Tibetan people and I met Tibetan Buddhism. So in a way, it was almost like I did journey into that mandala, and it took me to the Tibetans when I was 19.
Mhm. And I remember in the book you talk about how the Tibetan mandalas are so much more intricate than any of the other mandalas. Like they have a very
Mm-hmm.
complex system.
Yeah, they're very complex, but and also precise. Like the measurements between the different layers of the mandala are precise, and also the meaning of every single thing is precise. It's not like now people have mandala coloring books and so on, where they just kind of do whatever they want, within the structure of the mandala. And I'm not devaluing those coloring books. I do think they have a function and some benefit, but the Tibetan mandala is made more potent by the symbolism that's attached to it.
So your book focuses mainly on the inner mandala. And what I love so much about your book is that you actually give sincere teachings on fundamental Tibetan Buddhist topics that you have to understand to be a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner. But you do it in this way that's not like sly or anything, but it's so accessible that you sit there and you're like, wow, yeah, the ground of being, I really feel like I can return to that place, like just reading the words that you use. So I really value that. Obviously, the practices in there are very effective, and then the intellectual aspect really allows you to ground into some, tremendously potent and profound teachings.
It's interesting that you mentioned that part about the ground of being and the rupture from the ground of being, because to me, that's in a way the most important chapter of the book. And yet nobody has ever mentioned it in all the interviews that I've done. Nobody has mentioned that, because it's the crux of why we need the mandala. And it is also fundamental to an understanding of Vajrayana Buddhism and Dzogchen as well.
I so agree. I actually wanted to know if you'd read a bit on page 62, which specifically speaks of this.
The process of failing to recognize our inseparability from one ground creates a self-perpetuating condition, like a kaleidoscopic hall of mirrors, in which we seek to resolve our inherent alienation from the one ground through further projections outward. The ego's plot thickens, moving us further away from the one ground into dualistic confusion. We are all caught in the same dance, a self-perpetuating drama, a vicious cycle that creates chaotic karmic layers of dissatisfaction and suffering over lifetimes. Meditation practice slows down the reaction patterns of the ego so that eventually awareness can return to its own source and reunite with the ground from which it is ruptured. When we wake up, we realize there's never been a separation from the ground of being, although the constant activity of the ego has created the illusion of separation. The clear, blue, spacious sky of our being has been obscured. As the ego dissolves and our pure potential manifests, it is like the 5 rays of light that stream out of a crystal when struck by the sun. These 5 rainbow-hued lights are the basis of the 5 Buddha family wisdoms.
I feel like this is so helpful in understanding the path. So this book mainly then delves into the inner mandala, really exploring those 5 Buddha wisdom families. And we start here, but then you really move towards both the relative and the absolute. The absolute being recognizing our nature, and then the relative relating to everyday humanity, so including our emotions. And can you just talk about the significance of the mandala in particular in relating to both our relative and absolute daily experiences, maybe?
The mandala seems to play the role of bringing the fragmented psyche, or this fragmented self, back into wholeness. And one of the things that I noticed in in writing the book and in thinking about the mandala all the time, as you do when you're writing about something, is how many mandalas I am surrounded by in daily life. For example, looking at a flower is a mini mandalic experience. Chopping a cabbage in half and looking at the way it creates a mandala, cutting an apple in half. So much of our natural world is imprinted with mandala-like forms. And so that's one aspect that I really have noticed. And if we took a little bit longer moment with those experiences, such as looking at a flower, just stop a little bit longer and allow the experience of of course, beauty, but also the circle and the wholeness it expresses to imprint into our mind stream, we would be getting sort of like mini healing experiences throughout the day. And I'm sure with your work with the gardens and flowers, you've seen this. And so that's one aspect of the mandala, is just how it comes to play in our lives. And really noticing that and allowing that to happen. But even if we don't stop and become mindful of the experience of looking at something like that, it's still impacting us. And that's why we love those things so much. We love to see that spiraling toward the center in a cabbage cut in half, or looking at a flower and so on. So that's one way that it's really constantly arising in our environment if we allow it to be there. And even if we don't consciously allow it, it's still impacting us. The other way that I talk about the book is, as you say in about the mandala in the book, is about the Tibetan mandala of the 5 families, 5 Dakinis. And what that does is a much greater impact, because you're consciously entering into a mandalic experience in which you are in the center of the mandala as the white Buddha Dakini, and then you have the Vajra Dakini in front of you, the Ratna Dakini to your right, the Padma Dakini behind you, and the Karma Dakini to your left. And then all that is enclosed in a circle of fire, and then above is a tent of rainbow light. And so you're actually encapsulating yourself in a kind of like a transformation chamber, because each of those dakinis has symbolic meaning, which you learn about it. You know what that hooked knife in her hand means. What is the skull cup of blood at her heart? What does that mean? What does it mean that she's dancing, and so on? And so that symbolic imprint is also different than, say, if I just say, now visualize a symbol of cutting through subject-object fixation. Or just, if I just talk about subject-object fixation. When you know the meaning of that knife, it hits you at the level that symbols hit us. And that's different than cognitive conceptual mind. Plus, you're in the mandala. So you're in this transformation chamber with all the symbolic meaning, and you're bringing your psyche not only into wholeness, but into a process and an experience of transformation of the emotions into the 5 wisdoms. So it's very powerful.
So you have this line from the yogi Naropa in your book about how he keeps hearing his guru speaking in the sky. Look into the mirror of your mind, the mysterious home of the Dakini. I'm curious why it's so significant for those of us who are called to be in relationship with the Dakini. What is the importance of that, making that connection?
The Dakini is the foremost symbolic figure connected to the sacred feminine in the Tibetan tradition. she's not the only aspect of the feminine, but she's a very important one. And she is generally represented as fierce. She's dancing. She's wearing bone ornaments and other kind of accoutrements connected to the charnel grounds in India, which were liminal spaces between death and birth. And the Dakinis also traditionally appear in transition between, for example, at sunset, between day and night, or at dawn, between night and day, or at transitions in our lives. And I've noticed, I've been asking people as I've been going around, sometimes I say, how many of you here today are in transition in your life? And I swear like 90% of the people raise their hand. That somehow we're called to the Dakinis often when we are in transition. And I talk about in the book the fierce aspect of that and about transition in terms of labor. Maybe I could read that section, being in transition in labor. So as I was writing the book, my oldest daughter, Cherub, was pregnant, and she had her second baby at 43. And I was writing about how the Dakinis are connected to transition. And then I thought about it when she was in labor, when she was in transition, that part of labor. And so I ended up writing about my experience of transition and how I connect this to the Dakini. I think about the Dakini in the time called transition during childbirth, when the cervix must open the last few centimeters for the baby's descent into the birth canal. Transition is generally the most painful and challenging period during labor. And during this time, a woman must touch her wildness, take charge, and enter her deepest primal power. She often becomes fierce and must access the powerful Dakini within in order to move through transition, the tunnel of darkness, and bring her baby into the light. No one else can do it for her. I remember during my first labor witnessing the potency of the Dakini unleashed and in her full power. It was only months after coming back from India with my husband, and less than a year since I disrobed from being a Buddhist nun. Living on Vashon Island in the Puget Sound off the coast of Seattle, I chose to have a natural birth at home. We were living in a small berry picker's cottage, which had housed migrant workers harvesting currants on the island. Our heat and cooking came from a small wood stove. When the day came, I went into labor in the morning, and right away it was intense. By evening, I had been in hard labor for 8 hours when the doctor arrived from Seattle. My labor wasn't progressing, and he thought the baby's head was in the wrong position. Suddenly, I thought, I have to get this baby out. It's up to me. No one else can do this. What do I need to do? I tuned into my body, got off the bed, and onto the floor on my hands and knees. I told the doctor to leave me. I began weaving and shaking back and forth, up and down. My husband tried to approach and tell me to be calm and breathe quietly. But I told everyone to get out of the way. I wasn't nice or calm. I was fierce and clear. I was like a primal animal, sweating, shaking, and moaning, swaying back and forth wildly. The labor began to move forward. I got wilder as I entered transition, my body shaking while still on all fours. And before long, I held my newborn daughter in my arms. Had I done what I was told, I would have not turned her position. It was all the wild movement on all fours that helped shift her. Had I not taken it on, becoming fierce and clear and guiding myself from within, I might have had to be airlifted to a hospital in Seattle for a cesarean section. Yeah, it was one of those things that just happened to connect because I watched her in transition, and I was writing about the Dakinis connected to transition. But of course, when we talk about the Dakini and this question of transition, it happens that because those are times when we are more open. You know, when you first wake up in the morning and you're between the dreams and waking, or often those early morning dreams themselves, they have a quality of something can come through because we're in between those two states. And the Dakinis really come out of that kind of dimension. And that's why their language, the language of the Dakinis, is also called the twilight language. Mm-hmm. And it's a symbolic language. It's not like Sanskrit or Tibetan. It is a language, but it manifests as a few letters in something called the Dakini script. And out of those letters often come text, whole text. So somebody who receives a Dakini letter transmission, which would be called a terma or a treasure, would maybe receive 6 letters, something like that. But then he or she would look at those letters after certain ceremonies and so on, and then texts would come out of them, and then they would write that down. So that's the twilight language of the Dakinis.
In gratitude to our listeners and to support the making of this podcast, we want to let you know that you receive 10% off our shop of online courses and botanical delights, including tonics, teas, and skincare. Visit oliviaclementine.com and at checkout, enter the code LOVE and LIBERATION for the discount. And if you've enjoyed this, please leave a review and rating through iTunes. This helps this podcast become more visible to new listeners. Thank you, and now on to part 2.
It's tricky being a woman in this time and being sensual, sovereign, spiritual, kind of moving between all of that, or feeling like you kind of have to identify with one versus the other, and connected to the fierceness of the Dakini. Talk a little bit, kind of 2 sides of your experience. One, when you were a Buddhist nun, the benefits of that, of like any of your intimate inclinations that might naturally rise if you didn't have that celibacy forced upon you, you know, the benefits of that, of really being within ourselves, being whole within ourselves. And then you also talk about the Khatvanga, the symbol that a Dakini will often hold, or it can be a tent pole, or there's many uses for it. That inner consort, that balance of we, as women, we hold the masculine as well. And I would love to hear from you more about how our spiritual practice helps us have that wholeness of that masculine and feminine, so we can have that experience of the mandala within us.
Yeah, that's a very potent symbol, the Khatvanga staff, which the Dakini holds in the crook of her left arm. And it symbolizes, as you said, the hidden consort, skillful means, and compassion. So I had an experience in it was 1992, I believe. And I was fairly recently in relationship with the man who became my husband, David. We were together for 22 years. But at that time in my life, I was wounded from a previous marriage, and I was very, I guess you could say, reactive, and my abandonment demon would get activated easily. And I was, I had a hard time trusting the connection with him. And so at that time I went to Tibet by myself without him. No, not by myself in the sense of alone, but not with him. I took a group to Tibet. And I found that the symbol of the Khatvanga staff kept appearing on rocks and even on mountainsides. And some mountainsides, photographs, you can see very clearly the Khatvanga staff. And it was, for me, a time of learning that I could self-seed myself, if you know what I mean. Almost like impregnate myself with wholeness. and it was a difficult process I was going through because of this outer dependence on him, which I was struggling with. And by these rocks appearing, for example, I was at the conjunction, the delta of two rivers in Tibet, and we did a feast offering in a circle, Dakini feast, and it started not only raining but sleeting and snowing while we were sitting there in a circle. And when you're in a ceremony like that, you can't stop and get up and say, okay, we're going to move this inside. You just stay there. So we actually ended up being like up to, sitting on the ground, up to, over our legs in water that was freezing. And it was also very joyful, we were laughing and so on. But anyway, then at the end I got up and I walked out onto this delta between these two really rushing rivers, and I found a stone which was in the shape of the Khatvanga staff. And I thought, this is it. This is my message from this pilgrimage. I think often pilgrimages will have a theme. And so for me, the theme became self-seeding, or wholeness unto myself, being able to feel that masculine within myself and be healed by that, because I had felt so incomplete, like, I have to find this outer man to make myself complete. And so this process of sort of blocking up that hole where all this energy leaks out, that feeling, and realizing I am whole and sovereign unto myself. And I think that's the message of the Khatvanga.
I think on the other side too, I want to mention, because I appreciate this about you too, is your honesty in the longing for intimate partnership as well, and the naturalness of it not being a weakness. And you talk about after David's passing many years later, I think you said about 7 years later, you read a book that really helped you not feel like your longing was an issue, because a lot of people around you, using my own words, were basically saying, well, you had this incredible love. Isn't that enough? And you should be fine, for the rest of your life. And I think it's hard being a woman and, wanting to feel like we're sovereign, and yet there is a natural desire and the healing that comes from intimacy.
Yes, that's so true, Olivia. I read a couple of books. One is called Hold Me Tight, and another is called Attached. And it talks about how our need for safe attachment is really part of our genetic makeup, that from just being creatures that need to stay together to find protection. It's built into us. So that is really important to say, because I think it was 2 days ago was the anniversary of his death, and I put something up on my personal Facebook page, and somebody wrote to me and said, oh, but you should be happy for the love that you had. And I found when people said that to me, I know they said it in a way to comfort me, but it was so unhelpful to me,
Mm-hmm.
because I really feel that love, it's not like you can store it up, and then, okay, I got it for 22 years and now I've got enough for the rest of my life.
Mm-hmm.
It's a need, it's a constant need that we as human beings have to reach out and have somebody be there on the other end,
Yeah.
and somebody that is dependable
Mm-hmm.
and consistent. And I used to think that was a weakness or codependence or something like that. But in understanding better about this primal biological need, I realize it's actually very healthy. And that people who try to tell you, oh, you're being needy or you're too attached, that is usually people who are not comfortable with safe and healthy attachment. They're avoidant
Mm-hmm.
types. And so it's been a learning for me. I think in psychology in general, this is relatively new, that it used to be that the sort of psychological theory was, if you're together psychologically or healthy or whatever, then you don't need a relationship. You're happy as you are. And that's really shifted, and it's now being more accepted that you can be emotionally healthy and need and want a secure attached relationship.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's partially why I find the mandala work so powerful, because I think exactly what you share in the book, from my experience, is if we can become whole in ourselves, then we have the capacity to be vulnerable with another and open ourselves to want to be with somebody, because that takes tremendous courage to do it, especially from that whole place.
Mm-hmm.
So I really see such the practical and powerful aspect of this work for relationships.
Well, and particularly the Dakini Mandala, because you're seeing yourself as a fierce, naked, wild, empowered female,
Mm-hmm.
and holding these various accoutrements and so on. And I found that, for me personally, to visualize myself as that,
Mm-hmm.
as being in a sense sexual and spiritual, that the Dakinis are not that image of the desexualized or the sort of sanitized feminine. Our sexuality is part of us, and I'm not saying that they're sexy. I don't mean that, but she's clearly embodying that aspect of the feminine, and also fierceness. And so for me, this is so important, that women are not held to feeling, oh, if I'm spiritual, a spiritual woman is like the Madonna, and she has immaculate conception, or like the Buddha's mother, birthed from her armpit. Those images to me come out of a patriarchal fear of the whole woman, and of the powerful woman. And to think that the Buddha couldn't come out of his mother's vagina because it was impure is so incorrect. The vagina and the womb is such a pure place. I mean, if you smell a newborn baby, it's just absolutely incredible. It's like the smell of purity, absolute purity. And there has been this notion also in Buddhism, and it's taught that the womb is impure, that it's a dirty place, dirty, terrible place. and that's not true.
Can you talk a little bit too then about sacred sexuality? I'm very interested in union for liberation and just the possibility of seeing truth through intimacy.
In Vajrayana practice, which is Tantric Buddhism, which is also called Tibetan Buddhism, there is the idea that all the senses have liberating potential. So the sense of sight can liberate us if we can look at something, and maybe we can do this together as a you and your listeners can just do this little experiment. Just look at anything in front of you, and at first look at it in a dualistic way. Like I like, I'm currently looking at a window, and so I like that window. I like the window covering on it. I have an opinion about it. I want to go open the curtain, maybe. So I'm having that kind of external relationship with what I'm seeing. Or I could be, I don't like it. Why did they choose those window coverings? And it's so hot in here and the window's not working. I hate this window. So those let's just try to have that kind of dualistic relationship with whatever we're seeing. Maybe first the positive, like I really like it, and then shift it to the negative, like I hate that window, or I hate whatever I'm seeing. Okay, so then just notice how that feels. Okay, now we're going to shift to a more Vajrayana view of it. And so if we drop any notions about the window, we're simply looking at it, and we're actually experiencing ourselves in a non-dual relationship with it. That means that there's no journey between me and what I'm seeing. It's one. And notice how that feels. Can you tell me how that feels to you?
It feels very still, like there's no, there's no separation, but it feels like one whole experience.
Mm-hmm. Did you feel any kind of slight sensations of bliss arise in your body?
I wouldn't say bliss yet, but sensations of alleviation of something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So,
but I can imagine it being blissful if I sat there longer.
Yeah. Like a sensation of bliss could come, and then perhaps with that an experience of emptiness of it being empty of all those attributes and those opinions that we've attributed to it.
Definitely.
And so we're just in a very direct experience with it. So that's sight. We can do the same thing with sound. We can do the same thing with taste. Taste something. And instead of going into immediately, I like it, I don't like it, this tastes a little old, this is sweet, this is sour, whatever, just to be one with the taste. Then again, that experience that you described it as peacefulness, of unification, non-dual experience, perhaps bliss and emptiness is there at a deeper level of that experience. And we just did it for a few seconds. So, that's the Vajrayana experience, and it's transforming and using the senses for liberation. And when you think about sex and our sexual experience, when do we have a greater activation of our senses than in sex? It's all senses are being activated. So if we can enter into this non-dual experience of sight, of sound, of touch, of smell, and so on, all of the senses, hearing, then it's a potential vehicle for liberation, because it's such an intensely sensual sense experience. And but it should be understood that it's not limited to that. In other words, you can do this with your vision or with your hearing, with taste and so on, at any time that you're having those experiences of those senses. But in the sexual experience, if you can stay in that non-dual experience with the sexuality experience, then you can go so deep.
Mm-hmm.
It's so liberating. It's a liberating experience. And so that's why it's called a path to liberation, potential
Mm-hmm.
path to liberation. The other thing that I should say, which isn't maybe talked about so much, is intimacy as path. And I think we tend to have a sort of patriarchal view of tantric relationship. Of, I mean, the way it's been described traditionally is a man finds a woman and uses her for his practice, for his liberation. And it's not a relationship, and it has nothing to do with mutuality or mutual expression, mutual liberation, in the way it's been described. And so there's a book called Passionate Enlightenment, and I would recommend that you interview Miranda Shaw.
I reached out to her.
Did you? Good.
Yeah.
She talks about how these tantric yoginis in India, which is the phase of Vajrayana that she focuses on, is the early Vajrayana period, that these were long-term relationships that the people had together, the male and female yogin and yogini, and that often she was the teacher in that relationship. That's something to understand. And just for me personally, having been with David for 22 years, my experience of relationship as path wasn't only about this. It was about communication skills that we developed, being able to work with the darkness, work with what was difficult in the relationship, and stay in communication. And so my experience with him was that the longer we were together, the deeper it got, both sexually and emotionally. We both felt that.
Mm-hmm.
And I know because we talked about it the night before he died. We talked about it. Having those emotional skills and communication skills is really important, because relationship is not just sex. That's maybe 10% of your time. So much of your time is in other kinds of communication and working together or raising kids together or whatever.
And I so value that. Getting into some of the Dakini energies, I wanted to talk about the flow of karma and relating to the signs that we feel and see. We see in our dreams, that we notice, like what you were speaking of seeing all the symbols and katvangas. And your whole book, and I feel like this in general, you're so aware of the constant signs that are in your life, whether it's in the sky, in dreams, on stones. Mm-hmm. And curious how someone can really begin to cultivate mm-hmm. recognizing symbols and signs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, this is something that lamas do all the time, is noticing what's called tendril, which means interdependence. So, for example, if you request a teaching from a lama, you should always give symbolic offerings at the same time, because that creates the interdependence for that possibly to happen, for the teaching, for example, to occur. In terms of how to cultivate that view, I think you have to be a little bit careful, because it can get kind of, I guess you could say, trippy or ungrounded if you're like, everything has meaning, Mm-hmm. I just stubbed my toe, what does that mean? On the other hand, one of the meanings of mudra could be the great symbol, is what it means, and it's the ability to recognize the messages from the outer mandala and how they are interdepending with you. So it's a little bit like synchronicity. For example, that story I tell in the book about Jung, with a woman who he's having a really hard time with. She's very stuck in her animus, her masculine logos and so on, and he doesn't think he can maybe help her or work with her. And then she brings a dream to him of a golden beetle, a scarab beetle. And she's telling him the dream, and he hears this kind of tap on the window in his studio where he's seeing her. And he goes and opens the window, and there is a golden beetle. And he picks it up and he takes it to her, and he said, "Here's your golden scarab." And that broke through her logos dominated mind, and she became open, and he could work with her after that. And so that's a good example of the metaphor appearing synchronistically in our lives. And so the way that I work with it is just to observe things as you know, as something happens. What happened right before and right after that? Or watching weather patterns, watching birds also, particularly ravens. Ravens were known in Tibet. There was a whole process of divination based on ravens and how many caws they do. You know, they make those sound and so on. But anyway, I think it's a kind of openness to the environment and being in a more intuitive relationship with our world.
Mm-hmm. The last question I have for you is about the Vajra Dakini wisdom, because I think it's so important right now, this mirror-like wisdom in this day and age, especially in times of trying to create change. Can you talk about mirror-like wisdom as in terms of its potency for activism right now?
Uh-huh. I do talk about fierceness in the book and its potency, and seeing that in the Women's March. And I also noticed with that fierceness, there was a lot of humor and delight and no aggression. It was 5 million people marched, and there were no incidents of violence. It was pretty extraordinary. And people in very close proximity. The Vajra family is connected to anger and the transformation of anger into mirror-like wisdom. So it's important as we are fierce and as we manifest fierceness, which is an important aspect of the feminine that we should feel comfortable owning because it can be effective. If we can cultivate that kind of transformation of that anger into mirror-like wisdom, so that we have the fierceness with clarity, because that's the difference. Anger with hatred has a kind of burning clarity. You know how precise you can be when you're angry about someone else's faults or some kind of irritation that you have. When the egoic fixation is released from that and the pure energy is there, there's a kind of burning clarity. And it doesn't back down. It's not intimidated. And at the same time, it's not imbued with hatred. And that's really important for us women now, because if we get caught in hatred and ordinary anger, that will be running through our bodies all the time. And that's really draining. And it creates burnout, and it's unhealthy for us. We know that from scientific studies. So how do we deal with this anger then? We transform it. We take that energy, remove the fixation of clinging and grasping that's there, and let that burn. in its wisdom aspect as mirror-like wisdom, which has tremendous clarity. And I think an image this that I could say from a story that I know of someone that I know. She was a mother of several children who were teenagers, and she had one son who was really depressed, and he got to a point in that depression of being suicidal. And she was doing the fierce Dakini practice, and she had a suspicion he was going to do something one night, and she actually broke down the door of his room, and she found him sitting on the ledge of the window about to jump out. And he said to her, "Don't come any closer." And she didn't have time to think. Her wrathful Dakini manifested. She raced across the room and she pulled him off that ledge and probably saved his life. So she acted with fierceness and decision. And I know that's not necessarily the best thing to do with somebody who's suicidal. You know what I mean? I'm not saying that that's always what to do. I'm just using that as an example of this fierce clarity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it came from her Dakini practice.
Mm-hmm.
That she had that energy that was in her activated and guiding her.
Mm-hmm.
And saved his life.
Mm-hmm.
So we see this in mother animals defending their young. I know as a mother, I could be fierce with my children when they were in danger. And, there was no hatred behind it. There was no shaming. It was just like, no, stop. Yeah. And so that's this fierceness that maybe touches on this, but I think mirror-like wisdom has a deeper quality than that. That's just an example to show that there can be fierceness without hatred or anger. But the mirror-like wisdom has a very profound clarity that is something that needs to be experienced through meditation practice. And people that practice the Dakini Mandala practice, which is in the book, by the way, and also some other practices of working with a singular family, just with anger and the seed syllable and the color and so on, are in the book. But that depth is something that needs to be developed through meditation.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Lama Tsultrim, and I hope our listeners read your book. I'll have a link to it. It's really helpful if you are a beginner meditator or a more seasoned practitioner. I think it has clear practices and visualizations and explanations. So thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. It was really nice to talk to you.